Welcome to this year's BCxA Annual Conference. With our new virtual platform, there are a few things we need to cover with you before we get started. If you need to ask questions, you should have a question panel in your control center. Please submit all questions there for any speaker. We are recording today's presentation, and it will be on our YouTube channel later this week. The conference sessions begin next Monday. And we will also be recording those, so you can catch up with any of them if you've registered for the conference, whether it's live or on demand at a later time. And as you know, because we've gone virtual this year, we're not doing our golf tournament for the BCxA Scholarship Foundation. We have started a campaign this year to create a BCxA Family Summer Album. So while you're out doing your favorite activities, take a picture, include a BCxA logo if you've got it, and then submit it to us along with the donation to the foundation this year so that we can begin to build our scholarship foundation for all. So we could not do any of this today without our sponsors. We'd like to take a moment to thank them, our platinum sponsors, McKinstry and Horizon Engineering, both longtime sponsors and very active in our association. JB&B and Page, also longtime members and sponsors and on our board of directors, so thank you. And lastly, Grumman Buckus, who has been a silver sponsor for many years and also has active participation at the board and committee level. This year, we're excited to have our track sponsors. As you know, we have 5 tracks this year, one every Monday in August, and Blue Rhythm, Copper Tree, N8, Intertech, and Facility Grid are all track sponsors. Thank you for doing that. I also want to take this time to thank our conference planning committee. They have worked very hard this year, harder than any other year, due to the new platform. Going virtual means learning a bunch of new technology, getting speakers prepared to deliver in a webinar format versus on stage where you can cover a lot of things up. But our co-chairs, again, are Lynn and Jesse. You may remember them for their antics in Salt Lake, but also Tom, Allison, Joyce, staff of Nicole, myself, Diana, and Sherry. Jonathan Vaughn joined us from the Texas chapter, Ryan Lean, and Ryan Stroop. So thank you all for the incredible amount of time that you put into this program. And now I'd like to introduce our BCxA president. He's probably our youngest president, most energetic, and kept us all on our toes this year. He's a regional director with Horizon Engineering. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Liz. So, you know, the year of 2020, or the year of Ain't Nobody Gonna Hold Me Down. So a timeless tune that has been, you know, covered through the years, originally a reggae pop synth sensation from the 80s. You know, I most personally connect with the mid-90s version by Unique 2. I was hoping for some backup singers, but they seem to have gone home, so all I have is this white wall today. But definitely some strange times. This year, 2020, being our first and hopefully only virtual conference. But you know, the theme for the year is Ain't Nobody Gonna Break My Stride, Ain't Nobody Gonna Hold Me Down. So that's what we've been doing. Ain't nobody gonna hold down the BCxA. So we've been working tirelessly to bring you, great content in this conference. And before I get into it, Liz mentioned it, but thank you to these ladies right here. It's really difficult to do any recognition with them in a slideshow that you have to give to them for approval. So thank you, Liz, Nicole, Sherry, and Diana. We appreciate you more than you'll ever know. So thank you so much. Let's see if I have. Next slide, Liz. Do I have? Yep. Okay. So the themes and goals for leadership for 2020. Just to recap so far, for anyone who doesn't know, we met in sunny Phoenix, Arizona this past February, seems like a decade ago, to talk about our goals and leadership for 2020. So what we wanted to do to accomplish this year, to consider it to be a successful year, for me, a successful presidency. The first initiative being developing and recognizing the next generations of CXPs, a much needed website overhaul and redevelopment, a focus on education and training and making sure that our learning platform did not become obsolete from things outside of our control, focus on best practices for ongoing commissioning and the publication of that document, formation of an advocacy and liaisons committee, and then also establishment of an awards committee. Next slide, Liz. Okay, so check out 2020 leadership. Everyone was really engaged, really happy. Everyone's smiling, everyone's interacting. We're all in person together, which again seems like something out of a movie at this point, that we were able to all get together in the same room. I'm looking for the masks and I'm not seeing any, but everyone was really energetic, and we had a really great leadership conference, as we do every year. And for anyone that hasn't been to a leadership conference, I highly recommend you get to go, if not just for getting out of the house, but also just for the camaraderie, the networking, and the development that we do at the BCA. Next slide. So many smiles. Again, here we have all our, a bunch of our chapters connecting, chapter leadership getting together to really appreciate the sunny Phoenix, Arizona. I think we have some stalwarts in here that like to be in every picture. I won't say who specifically, but everyone having a really good time. Next slide. And so much potential. So we got together, we got to do a little axe throwing, a little networking. We had our first and currently only live podcast session with Talking to the Dark Side with Tom, Lynn, Tracy, Lean, and myself. Next slide. But one of us could feel the storm brewing. Oh, sorry. One of us could feel the storm brewing, and that was Mr. Craig. Mr. Craig, so updates from March 26th. I wanted to try and do the movie phone voice here, but it didn't work. So it's one man. We definitely felt the oncoming, and there's been some substantial impact to everyone in the industry. Pre-COVID, two pictures of America's sweetheart. Yours truly, Mr. Tom Hanks, both of whom have been impacted specifically by the COVID pandemic. For anyone that doesn't know, I had to self-quarantine in an airport hotel due to a positive case on the project I was working on, and I didn't want to bring it home to my friends and family, but also had to continue to close out the project since it was deemed as an essential project by Governor Cuomo here in New York. So it was a tough 3 months, and I'll say I'll handle it pretty well. Next slide. Okay, maybe I didn't handle it so well. So this is an actual picture of me 3 months in. Haircuts, I've given myself about 3 haircuts on my own since then, not too shabby. And then also Tom Hanks, he did a lot worse than me, keeping pretty slim over there, but looking pretty rough overall. So, but I do like to try and stay positive throughout it all. And when life gives you lemons here, so having a little fun as gentlemen do with their facial hair when they tend to grow a little bit out, but when life gives you lemons, you make sure to, next slide, give them a lemonade. So the internet is an amazing place, folks, where you can really put your face on anything from the president, historical art pieces, or Tiger King himself. So, being in quarantine for a little bit, you go a little crazy, and you look to do some creative things with your time. So next, on to the accomplishments of the BCA so far. So what have we accomplished this year? So we have the publication of the ongoing best practices. So we were successful here, and we were the first to market with this type of document. We debuted it at ASHRAE Winter Conference with a presentation with Tracy Jumper and Bruce Pitts. There's a link to it here. I'm really proud of the group that put this together. They were able to do this in a short amount of time. It was 10 to 12 months from inception to publication, and that just speaks to the flexibility and the technical expertise we have on our staff and dedication from our volunteers. So thank you everyone involved in that. We really appreciate it, and helps us be on the cutting edge of our industry overall. So there was the introduction of the 2020 BCA podcast. This is available on all major platforms with Mr. Lean and myself. We're still working on an official title, something like Tales from the Boiler Room. So far, we have 6 episodes published to date. Hundreds of listeners, very active listenership, which has been great so far. Membership from the USA, Canada, but also uniquely, we've had a couple listeners from Brazil, 2 from the UK, and actually 1 from the Ukraine. So I'd like to hear from that individual. If you're out there, reach out to me. I'd love to hear how you heard about that. We're currently temporarily transitioning to a vlog format, a video blog, hoping to get a little more content and do some remote Zoom meetings, as you've been seeing out there on the internet. But as always, we're looking for our membership to nominate an interviewee, someone that you'd like to hear from in our membership, outside of our membership. We're always looking for new candidates to get together and talk about their introduction to the commissioning industry, how they've been successful, and kind of also their biggest flops, we'll say, throughout their career, to kind of help that young and next generation realize that it only gets better. So. Next slide. Thank you. So we've also been bringing you focused content in 2020. So here we have, a lot of the blog and articles that have been posted on the pandemic response, how it relates to building commissioning, ongoing commissioning, returning to the office space. You can see in the lower right-hand corner our first blog, which AJ Spicer from one of our upcoming sessions, and then also the Some Good Commissioning session, which turned out to be about a 25-minute TV episode out there. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, look at our BCA LinkedIn profile for an episode of Some Good Commissioning. I think a lot of the membership had a good time putting together, and really looking to get the conference out there, to engage people and just get them involved, and hopefully attend to the conference in the next couple weeks. Next slide. New website rollout. So currently this is confidential, as you can see from the watermark, but we've gotten some really good feedback on the website so far. Some good, beyond color change schemes, a little bit more of an enhanced navigation, a little easier to get around, a little bit user experience, and then also better access to our training and education direct from the website. So stay tuned for that. We are only halfway through the year, folks, and we still got a lot coming through the rest of the year. Introduction of the BCA store. So this is up and running and live, and I believe we'll be sending out a link to this in the checklist going out in a couple weeks. So it's a land-end store, open for individual orders. I myself just got this delivered here today. Got a couple other items. We're also in discussions for additional stores with Carhartt and other manufacturers to make sure that we're getting you the best price and the best products. As you can see from the Land's End store, we have a plethora of options. You can get a waterproof jacket, or if anyone wants to go halvesies on some lunar fanny packs, they only come in orders of 35 or more. So reach out to me if you want a BCA fanny pack, and we can make a mass order together. So the Advocacy and Liaisons Committee, we successfully formed and approved a charter for 2020. Our scopes and goals for the years were to identify new and forthcoming building codes as they relate to the commissioning process and its qualified provider, a review of the standards that are out there that impact the process, such as ongoing commissioning, or practice of commissioning developed by third parties out there, keep abreast of legislative actions that may impact certifications, such as some things that are going right now in some of the lower states as it impacts legislation, building codes and standards and certifications. Serve as subject matter experts in the industry as needed when it comes to building commissioning, to make sure that our voice and best practices are heard, and also creation of the liaison positions to relate them to other industries that we partner with, and kind of we have that sister relationship with, ASHRAE, NSPE, and so forth. So, my big initiative for 2020 was the engaging future generations of CXPs. and how do we do this? So maintaining that scholarship foundation, as many of the chapters probably know, it is difficult to give away money. But maintaining that, advertising it, and making sure we utilize those funds as best possible to engage those next generations, whether it be in their current schooling or through education training via the BCA. We had a successful virtual happy hour led by Tom Poling a couple weeks ago, which was great. We look to do more sessions similar to that with a little bit more engagement. I have to shout out to Western Canada for sponsoring student memberships for the upcoming conference. And as well as this past Friday, the Northeast sponsored a corporate rate to allow 10 emerging professionals to attend the conference and come and learn all that the BCA has to offer. So, we are always looking for additional ideas. Some of the ones that are out there is to, similarly donate the extra corporate seats if you have them to an emerging professional. But even if, that's not applicable, allowing your entry-level staff to check out the content that we work so tirelessly to put out there. It's great for you. It's great for entry-level. There's the, the introductory sessions as well as higher technical sessions. So we really encourage just, giving them access to it so they can tinker in on it on their own. The sessions will be available for 6 months, up to 6 months after the conference. So it doesn't have to be during billable workable hours. It can be after the fact or in their lunch period or on their own, just to make sure that you're engaged. Your engaged employees are getting the content they probably are really looking for out there. Next slide. So we also wanted to put together a 20 under 40 award program. That application has been approved by the IBOD. It's actually available today. For 2020, we will be waiving the application fee. So make sure to get your entrance in by the deadline, just to look to recognize your employees who are under 40, who are up and coming in the commissioning industry or have already established themselves. Recipients will be notified prior to the BCA annual meeting, and they will be announced at the BCA annual meeting. We're also announcing today that we will be holding an annual meeting via webinar mid-October. It'll probably be a 60 to 90-minute session, just giving an update on what we've accomplished at the end of the year and what we're looking to do again for the rest of the year in 2020 into 2021. So how has COVID impacted the commissioning provider? One thing we can see is that the news and media is really focusing on what matters. So a couple of weeks ago in New York, Governor Cuomo recommended placing HEPA filters in malls for reopenings. And the next day he had to come on TV and apologize to the HVAC industry for not saying MERV rating instead of saying, he said MERV rating instead of HEPA. Sorry, he said HEPA rating instead of MERV rating. I can't even get it right. So, that's the world that we live in today, with virtual meetings and also, our government officials talking about MERV filters and HEPA ratings on the news. So, if you asked any of us 6 to 12 months ago, if, Governor Cuomo would be talking on the national news about MERV ratings, we would have called each other crazy, but crazier things have happened. So, and I promised Liz I wouldn't bring this up during this conference, but Kevin Thurston brought it up to me. So Liz, I'm sorry, but I'm really proud of what Governor Cuomo has done, some really great communication skills. So, thank you. And Liz, I hope it's okay that we brought that up. Next. So, role of the commissioning provider, the 2020 edition. So, this quote on the right, I see more and more from commissioning providers out there. The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of low price is forgotten. So it seems like that's kind of one of the unofficial commissioning quotes out there on various blog posts and just their quoting kind of general LinkedIn. So there's been a call to action for hospitals and pop-up facilities, and for the most part, we've been that owner's first call as commissioning providers. We have that in-depth knowledge. They've leaned on us to come in, help them optimize their facility, both for the reduction in occupancy, monitoring during the reduced occupancy, and then also now the potential return to occupancy or decreased occupancy throughout the country. So, our role in being the operations design, kind of having that full life cycle of the building and having the history of these buildings, existing and new facilities, is really coming into play to show our strengths and how we can really impact the industry moving forward. So what is the future of the commissioning provider? And these topics are just what I've been talking with a lot of clients, owners, and other commissioning providers out there. So it's not official, but really kind of the the chatter that we've been hearing in the industry. So there's going to be an increased demand for quality providers out there who are looking to follow the best practices, and that could be and is the BCA best practices. So that that low cost hopefully is going to be continuing to go away while we focus on quality that gives us that true and proven service. We also anticipate to see an increased scope of service with focused areas, focus on indoor air quality, focus on resiliency and safety, and then also an increased demand for monitoring and remote options. For the operations team that can't be in the building or needs to look at their building remotely, if this crops back up and we have another stay order in place, or also future pandemics as it relates. We see an increased demand for flexible, resilient, and scalable spaces, modular construction, so we can have a quick response. These spaces can be transitioned from their normal operation into COVID response areas or pandemic response spaces. And then, one of the big things we've been talking about is that a shift from commissioning for energy reduction, which has been kind of one of the driving forces of the last couple of years for everyone, to a commissioning for safety and wellness. Obviously there's a trade-off with increased outside air compared to energy reduction, but our focus right now is on making sure people are safe, happy, and healthy, and that comes with an energy cost, unfortunately. A lot of the growth sectors are going to mimic the pandemic response. I read an article today. There is a $9.4 billion budget over the next 4 years for upgrading and maintaining the New York City hospital system. So that and life science centers and laboratories. So the construction industry over the next handful of years is going to mimic what we're focusing on right now. And there's a good chance that demand for previous building types is going to be put on the back burner. Residential, hotels, common use spaces that are kind of a luxury in times of good economy, where right now we need to focus on how to tackle these issues at hand. Next. So the question for all of us is, how can we respond? So I know the first thing that comes to mind for me is education and training. And where do I go for that? I come to the conference. I come to the BCA website because we're the premier destination for this training. So, sending your younger members to the training, allowing time for them in your upcoming budgets for 2021 and beyond. We need to get them trained up so that they are capable and able of, knowing how we're responding to this and the best practices and everything. We all have our unique superpower out there. Whether it be HVAC, electrical, critical systems, we're all kind of jack of all trades, but we have our specific item. And I really see us looking to bond together in education and training the next generation of passing on those superpowers so that the next, the future of our built environment can, be as healthy as possible. And we do our best to make sure that we're passing on all the great information we've learned both in the field and via the BCA and just our experiences. So next, I'd like to introduce.
Hey, Dan.
Yep.
Dan.
Yep.
If we can just we had a couple of questions I thought we'd ask real quick before we moved on.
Yep.
So one of the questions that came up was, what are your thoughts about the future of new construction and how COVID has maybe changed the plans for adding more buildings, and if we'll even return to all of our buildings? Do you or has any of the board talked about this in depth yet, or is it too early?
So it's a little bit too early. I think a lot of that ties into the, when we do return, what is it going to look like? It's really going to be kind of company and sector specific. There's probably going to be an increase on, looking at data centers. I know if anyone's looking at Amazon stock, it's through the roof for warehouse spaces, just for, what they're looking to do. So, I definitely think that like I said, we're going to mimic that response. Buildings and offices as we know it. I don't think we'll ever get away from the office overall, but we'll definitely see some modification, whether it be a reduced occupancy, codes and standards being updated to reflect this reduced occupancy, and just the operations also reflecting that throughout the buildings. There were some statistics out there that hotels in New York City are, they need to be at about 60 to 70% occupancy to be profitable, and currently they're running at 20%. So, an prime example right there is, what does that mean? I think we have to think about that as an industry. Is that going to be a transition? Are they going to shut down? Are they going to go to temporary hoteling or residences or apartments? I also know that where I live on the east end of Long Island, the real estate away from the city, which typically stays, increased a little bit during the summer months, has recently skyrocketed 30% since COVID, because people are fleeing the major cities in their residence and apartments and looking to move to the suburbs as a result, just to get away from that congestion. So people are definitely reacting, and I think that the building sectors are going to, react similarly to some extent.
So one more question. You talked about the buildings a little bit that are being affected right now, but is there, and there's new information coming all the time for us to respond to. Is there any information, any things that you think we should do now that probably won't be affected by what we learn continuously with COVID, like, the filters you talked about, or how do you change the, the incoming air? What do we need to do that pretty much is standard across the board, do you think, or is there anything?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of best operations practices that have been underutilized or ignored for years, that we've been harping on. A lot of things that we as commissioning providers have said are best practice. It's the verifying an effective filter program, where I've worked on many projects where it's been a deficiency, where you're showing the gaps in the filter, in the filter banks, and failed filters, or maintenance procedures that look to overload filters. So there's definitely a lot of our best practices that align with or best practices in commissioning and retro commissioning existing building that align with that really align with how we should be running our buildings. And again, a lot of our strengths that already exist out there in the existing building or in our retro commissioning programs really line up with how we can provide value to our owners. Unfortunately, some of the things that we may be looking to do again, have a negative energy impact on the building, maintaining higher than regular humidities, and they're also going to have capital improvement costs. So the installation of humidifiers in a space that previously didn't have one, or installation of UV lights in a space to look to combat, or UVC lights to take care of potential viruses and particles throughout. There's probably also going to be a lot of, I don't want to say fluff, but a lot of people looking to make a dollar off of this and make recommendations and say things like, oh, well, this filter will completely trap, capture and kill, this COVID virus or future viruses. So I think as BCA providers following best practices, we have to make sure to educate our clients on, not tell them exactly what they should be looking for, but help them to avoid the tricky snake oil salesman, as it relates to the reoccupancy of buildings, and just getting back to normal on day one or day two for these occupants.
Great, thanks. We'll let you get on to the next part, but I do want to remind everyone that we have several sessions in all 5 of the tracks that will address some hot topics around COVID and what buildings can do. So make sure you check those out. And with that, Dan.
Great, yeah. So I'm going to read this verbatim because it's too impressive to mess up any of it. And Dr. Kevin, I apologize. I'm going to put your name. I'm going to try my best. Yep.
We got the Benner Award yet.
We got the Benner Award. You're shaking things up with me. So Benner Award. So this year I have the privilege of, I think it's right here. Here we go. This year I have the privilege of announcing the 2020 Benner Award winner. Each year, the BCA looks to recognize individuals or organizations that strive to make building commissioning process as usual, in honor of Nancy Benner, that was her goal. This year's winner, as New York City's primary capital construction project manager, they have built many of the civic facilities New Yorkers use every day. This organization provides communities with new or renovated structures such as firehouses, libraries, police precincts, courthouses, senior centers, and more. Their commissioning program, which was established around year 2000, oversees the commissioning service for over a dozen city sister agencies, and they have on record completion of 100 retro commissioning projects and over 55 new construction projects and 75 active projects. Some of their higher profile projects include the Queens Botanical Garden, the New York AIA recognized Public Safety Answering Center, the renovation of the historic Queens Museum at the World's Fair, the state-of-the-art New York City Police Academy, along with the current construction of 3 Center of Excellence projects in response to the COVID pandemic to serve the underserved communities in the outer boroughs of New York City. So, I personally know them, and they work to improve their commissioning program to meet and exceed the best industry practices as their program continues to develop each year. And so I'd really like to thank the New York City Department of Design and Construction, or DDC, for all your efforts in making building commissioning business as usual. Accepting the award today is going to be Matthew Park and Rebecca Massey from the New York City DDC Commissioning Unit. So thank you, team. It's something, we'd really appreciate you, and, we'd like to congratulate you with this award.
So both Rebecca, there you go, Rebecca and Matthew, if you can unmute your microphones.
Okay, hello. I have to turn around this camera somewhat so I can show myself. Okay, let's see how I do this. Okay, can I just speak?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you very much for the award. The commissioning team and all of our colleagues at DDC take a lot of pride in building the city. And so it's an honor to be recognized for our efforts to turn over a good quality public buildings. And we'd like to thank BCxA for your efforts in developing standards and processes to help us to deliver good projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay. Liz, are we good to move on to the next portion?
Yes, and I just want to let Matthew and Rebecca in the mail, didn't hear on time, so you will receive it in the next few days. Thank you very much. And Dan, we are ready to introduce our keynote speaker.
Okay, our keynote speaker, Dr. Kevin van Den Wymelenberg, is the professor of architecture at the University of Oregon. He founded the Institute for Health in the Built Environment and directs the Biology and Built Environment Center and Energy Studies in Buildings, Laboratory. His work seeks to broaden the network of researchers and practitioners such that issues concerning health, comfort, sustainability, and the human ecosystem are addressed in a way that benefits our work, our community, and our planet. He has a PhD in the built environment from the University of Washington, and he's consulted on several hundred new construction and major renovation projects with architects and engineers, and several of these projects have been recognized with AIA's Committee on the Environment Top 10 Awards. He's been invited to speak at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the U.S. House of Representatives, and many conferences. He has authored over 100 articles related to building design, operation, and performance. He has secured over $15 million in funded research and in energy and environmental quality for organizations such as the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, U.S. EPA, U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, among others. So thank you, and Dr. Kevin, take it away.
Excellent. Can everyone hear me? Are we good?
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks so much to this group for inviting me, and really excited to be with you all today. I'm going to say right up front that we've been working quietly and quickly in the background to get a backup plan on the slides working. My university upgraded their security seemingly over the weekend, and now I can't play my video or off my laptop for everybody. So we're going to rock and roll. We're going to have a lot of fun, and we're going to do it in synchronized slideshow mode here with Nicole running the slides and me offering the voiceover. So Kevin van Den Wymelenberg, professor of architecture, University of Oregon, direct the Institute for Health in the Built Environment, a group called the Biology and the Built Environment Center, a lab that focuses on energy efficiency. And, why not? Because we egghead professors like to just throw on the credentials. We're opening an acoustics lab here soon, too. So we are all up in building science and having a blast. Next slide will show you a little bit about my team. This is a group of us. If anybody knows Charlie Brown, he's pretty well known in the field. He just recently passed away, in fact, just before coronavirus. He's the gentleman there in the front row with the striped shirt. Really, he founded the lab and brought much of this team together. And about 5 years ago, I started leading the group. And the first thing I wanted to do, you can go to the next slide, was to look at how these multiple labs could work together better. So the Baker Lighting Lab had been around for 2 decades. The Energy Studies and Buildings Lab had been around for 4 decades. The Biology and the Built Environment Center had been around for 8 decades with funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And they were all really working independently. And ESBL, the Energy Lab, and the Biology Lab had some partnerships going on studying microbes indoors, which I thought was really fascinating. And when I joined, I thought, this is really around health in the built environment. It's an emerging topic. We know it's increasingly important. We knew that 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. And there's been a lot of sort of nebulous thinking around what does it really mean to have a healthy building. And one of the things I wanted to do is try to crystallize that and bring more science and rigor to that, but also make sure it's relevant and applicable to buildings, because as a researcher, we love to write white papers, but they often sit on a shelf. And so I had made it through most of my career and climbed the ranks as professor and whatnot now. So what was really exciting is this opportunity to change the way we do a higher ed. And we've got this really dynamic partnership with lots of folks in industry. And you see some of the logos on the right side of that slide. And also recognizing that no university has all the capabilities that any particular industry might need. If you look at the top left corner, we've been trying to stitch together multiple universities with multiple disciplines to really bring scientific rigor to industry-driven questions. So this is really about the questions of practice driving the science, which I think is really a fascinating way to work. Next slide. So the talk today is really just thinking about how this pandemic and really more broadly health in the built environment is going to shift architecture, building operations, and of course by extension, therefore everything to do with building commissioning, retro-commissioning, recommissioning, ongoing commissioning or continuous commissioning. I know I have to shout out the trademark on continuous commissioning, which I think is Texas A&M's. But all of that is really going to be impacted. And I think, you can go to the next slide, we saw that over the last 100 years, but the signal started to fade away after the last pandemic, the 1918 influenza or Spanish flu. But I thought I'd retrace a little bit about buildings and cities even, and next slide, and learn a little bit what we can take from lessons from the past. So here at the very basic, like as human civilizations become civilizations, moving from agrarian or hunter-gatherer to agrarian to civilizations, we thought a lot about where we were going to settle. We thought a lot about where we were in terms of proximity to water, to food, to energy resources. We thought about climate. We picked locations along river bends because of access to transportation, et cetera. And then if you go next, you start to see how those places, next slide, started to transform with our energy production and really became dense and kind of what I'll call fossilized energy. It turbocharged the industrialization process. Next slide. And that actually had some pretty substantial health consequences. And so there were early outbreaks of various diseases. Maybe it were cholera or tuberculosis. A lot of our modern sanitation and sewage systems were about getting horse manure out of the street and sanitized. That's why we see so many combined sewer and sanitary toilet systems, and why sometimes we still spill sewage, raw human effluent, into our rivers because of these original infrastructures that were paired, where we were taking the horse manure out of the streets and treating it just like we were treating human waste. And a lot of these systems were put in place to try to create these densely occupied spaces where commerce and community happened, but tried to make them as sanitary as possible. So we have indeed been building our systems, our infrastructures, our cities and our buildings around health from the very beginning. Next slide. But I'd say with the 1918 pandemic, we really started to think about this at another level, and it forced maybe even some of these ideas about these garden cities, where now we have city centers, which are dense commerce, and we have these hub and spoke models where you have the suburbs, where it's a little bit more of an enjoyable place to live and breathe a little bit cleaner air. And we're actually seeing some negative consequences to that as well. But just in case you were interested, next slide, you can see much of what we were doing in 1918 seems like we're reliving it now 100 years later. So I'm calling this the 100-year pandemic and saying, guess what? We are designing our buildings around things like the 100-year flood. We're accustomed to designing our buildings around managing for fire and other acute threats. And we can design and manage our buildings around this as well. And I do believe we are going to see a new level of standards and policies and regulations related to creating healthy buildings. I think the COVID-19 pandemic, because of where we are in our place in history and the technology that's available to us today, is going to see the lessons that we learned from 1911 and have much more policy and much more lasting implication. Next slide. And you could see in 1918, in the architecture that emerged in the 20s and 30s, it thought a lot about light and air. And that was because that was something we learned from the 1918 flu, is that, and even going back another century before that, thinking about Florence Nightingale and patient recoveries from various afflictions during wartime era, good old natural sunlight, good old fresh air was a big piece of the solution. Next slide. And, you know, from larger urban settings to more quaint rural settings, the architecture became very much about access to light and air, these machines for living. Architecture as a machine for health even came out as a concept. Next slide. But I think time marched on, and energy became incredibly inexpensive and incredibly available at a level that we had never seen before. We talk about, in the utility industry, we talk about the nines, which is how many nines, 99.999% reliability do we have in our utility grid. And I say in the early years of the utility grid, it was from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. or from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. You had to choose when you were going to use the power. The buildings used the power during the day, and the streetlights used the power at night. So next slide, and then we'll start to think about inventions like Carrier coming out with space cooling and these kind of advertisements that were really equating comfort with health. And I'd say that's a pretty substantial shift in thinking. And it was occurring during a period of time when energy was becoming more and more available. And I'll say, you know, I don't know about you, but I find sitting on my couch at night watching, binge watching Netflix with a bowl of popcorn to be pretty doggone comfortable. But I think we could all acknowledge that that might not be the healthiest. And I think you take that analogy to the building sector and you say, look, is it really the healthiest solution to have, incredibly dry indoor environments that are incredibly stable from a temperature standpoint? We have no variability. We're keeping our, buildings maybe as much as 40% relative humidity, but probably much of the year, much less than that in many locations. So they're very dry because that's, good for the longevity of a building. And they're very stable in comfort. And from a temperature standpoint, they might vary between 68 and 74 degrees, maybe only 69 and 72 degrees. And so we've designed ourselves into this incredibly tight margin of thermal experience and incredibly dry indoor landscapes that are as dry as deserts. And I think we've started to conflate and maybe from even to a problematic standpoint, incorrectly associate comfort with health. Next one. We always have recognized that a connection to nature is important. And so we've seen the proliferation of this glass house and it's taken this Philip Johnson glass house, 1949. This is an incredibly beautiful piece of architecture, a great way to connect with nature, obviously incredibly energy intensive. And we've seen this kind of concept find its way into pretty well every form of architecture, including high rises, where the notion of sort of sustainability has somehow, or the notion of connecting with nature anyway, has come into these glass boxes. Next slide. And when we had this quote, 1954, Lewis Strauss says, energy will be too cheap to meter. That was okay. We got both and. You had tons of heat gain and heat loss out that glass, but, we had heating and air conditioning, and we had incredibly inexpensive and available power. Next slide. And while our electric utility grid and our natural gas utility grid didn't quite feel the same exact squeeze as the petroleum market did in this image here, and I will say I wasn't alive, but I know that there were ripple effects, but felt most strongly in the petroleum market. We had, all of a sudden we were confronted with a crisis around energy resource. And whether or not it was, a contrived crisis is kind of beside the point. We started to think about energy in a whole entire way. And in the mid-'70s, or maybe even, I can't remember, might have been 1972 here in the United States, we had the California Energy Commission, and we had the first Title 24. And from there, we have a world of code and energy regulation. That event was visceral, and everybody felt it. And you can see the gentleman in line trying to get gas for his lawnmower. He felt it pretty viscerally, and we are all feeling COVID-19 in an incredibly visceral way. And the energy regulation industry was spawned from that 1970s, those series of oil crises. And I will say the healthy building regulation industry will spawn from COVID-19. Next slide. So solar architecture somehow shifted from health to energy in the 70s and 80s, and you can see these concepts of solar architecture. No longer was it so much about health and access to light and fresh air and circadian rhythm, or even the disinfection effect of ultraviolet irradiation in our buildings. It was all about energy. And now we have another conflating. This notion of connection to nature was very much about energy, whereas we need to kind of relearn that connection to nature around access to health. Next slide. You can see we are living in a whole new world of indoor habitations. Next slide. I think it's kind of exemplified by this marketing campaign. This is Velux Corporation. They make skylights that are also operable for ventilation. And they put this marketing campaign together called the Indoor Generation, basically saying we are living in hermetically sealed boxes, largely because of the energy regulation, incredibly tight envelope, very low infiltration, incredibly narrow tolerances, and hermetically sealed environments that are also HEPA filtered in many cases. And this is all around keeping the evil outdoors out. And what it also does, it keeps the unknowingly evil indoors in. And you can see the child there standing amidst a pile of toys and, flame retardant. You can just imagine flame retardant, bed sheets and mattresses and antimicrobial paints on everything. And we have this attitude around cleanliness that the outdoor is bad, the indoor is clean. And we've unknowingly been introducing ourselves to long-term low-dose exposure to a whole range of chemical toxicants. Next slide. Okay, enter COVID, enter the pandemic. And here I am to say that this is more than just 6-foot circles. The future of architecture, building operations, mechanical engineering, commissioning is going to change, and it's going to be more than everyone taking a little bit lower occupant density and spacing folks out, maybe with some spray shields for sneezes. It's going to change in really fundamental ways. I'm going to try to unpack some of what I think, but obviously we're only a few months into this. There's a lot to learn still. And so I can't promise I'm going to give you a full glimpse into the next 20 or 30 years, but I think it'll be an interesting journey. Next slide. Okay, so I want to unpack the unseen. Really, so much of this pandemic, we've been fighting the the invisible. And as we move through, I hope to give you confidence that we have technologies and techniques that can start to make this invisible visible. Next slide. I also want to recognize that we've really dramatically transformed the way we are living. So, and maybe in an extreme here, showing the Mesa Verde and the cliff dwellings on the left versus some sort of spaceship Earth on the right. Proverbially, we've moved from caves to spaceships, and we've done it in a relatively narrow margin period of time. Really, the Industrial Revolution, but even more arguably in the last 80 years, since 1940. 1940, the 40s it marked kind of a revival in the economy post-World War II. It marked availability of cooling. It marked reliability of the electric grid and really a substantial acceleration in the Industrial Revolution and the expansion. And in that period of time, we've moved to be incredibly an indoor species. And so through that, we've lost a little bit of the connectionness to the outdoor world. And that affects us in lots of ways. I think, next slide, you'll see, this is one of the foibles of this process, but I'll just have to visually describe this video. You can see the woman here, and she's kind of grayed out, and you can see the bacteria that are living in her, on her, and you can just imagine that every time she exhales, particulate matter get put out onto that drawing, and you can see a little bit of the remnant of her hand on the drawing from when she touched it earlier. And then this visual then flies you inside of the building and recognizes that we live in a microbial soup. And the notion of clean is really a fallacy, that no matter what we do, no matter how we try to sterilize our environment, even the Mars rover has got Earth-associated microbes. And it's one of the things that NASA is incredibly nervous about, of trying to be careful of, terrestrial transfer. But by human weight, about 10 pounds of the average person is non-human microbial life. By cell count, you're actually more non-human than you are human. And this shouldn't be weirding you out or freaking you out. It usually does. But really what it means is that we live in a symbiotic relationship with microbes, and we are learning more and more about it every year. And we've all gotten a little more comfortable with it when we think about our gut microbes. And maybe if you get sick and you go to the doctor and you get an antibiotic, the doctor might now be prescribing you some Nancy's yogurt from Eugene, Oregon here, and helping you replenish your gut microbes. And that whole notion of creating a healthy microbiome for our gut, I will argue, can also be considered for our buildings. Next slide. So here at the Biology in the Built Environment Center, which is a function within the Institute for Health in the Built Environment, we have been studying microbes in buildings for a decade. And these are just some images of kind of places we've studied and a little bit of a kind of canvas of things that we've been learning. So first, we know that daylight and sunlight implicates indoor microbiomes, that spaces that see sunlight, even if it's passing through normal UV filtering glass, has a distinctly different microbial community structure than bacteria that live in rooms that are in total darkness. We're doing ongoing research right now around different types of lighting and those implications. And then, of course, we've all probably heard in the COVID pandemic about the value or the potential of UVC germicidal irradiation. And there's like 5 different flavors of that and different wavelengths. And we had been studying that with regards to things like natural daylighting in buildings, and indeed it makes a difference. The source of the ventilation, whether it's coming through ductwork or whether it's coming directly through a window, also shifts the indoor microbial community. If you go to the next slide, I think, unfortunately, this is going to be a video that won't play also, but I can talk through it. And in fact, the still that you see on the screen is not half bad to explain the idea. So really what we're seeing here is an understanding that each building, each room type within this business complex here at the University of Oregon, we mapped it for its microbial signature. We went into every single room and we took dust samples from surfaces, and we used what's called high throughput DNA sequencing, and we use a process called polymerase chain reaction, and we can understand the makeup of a bacterial community or a fungal community or a viral community, or broadly speaking, the microbiome of each of those rooms. And we knew that because we tested it, we knew that restrooms look different than offices, and classrooms look different than hallways. And there's a lot of reasons. It might be water sources. It might be the activity. You know, there's probably a reason why bathrooms look different than hallways. At least we hope so. What we also learned was this building, because we had worked on this years ago from a natural ventilation standpoint, we had designed in two types of office spaces. So some offices were mechanically ventilated, and others had the option of either being mechanically ventilated or passively ventilated. And we went to some of the rooms that were passively ventilated, and we looked at the difference of the indoor microbial community structure. And the long and short of it is that the mechanically ventilated rooms looked fundamentally different than the naturally ventilated rooms, and that in general there was a more diverse microbial community structure in the naturally ventilated rooms. And interestingly, and probably most important from a COVID pandemic standpoint, the mechanically ventilated rooms had more human-associated microbes. And if you have more human-associated microbes, statistically speaking, you are more likely to encounter a pathogen. Next slide. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to take this to the Oregon Health and Sciences University, and all of this one really does was zoom in on the building we're studying, and you can just imagine the Google Earth fly through. And then I'm going to let you jump to the next slide, and you'll see a little bit about what we have done there. So this is pre-COVID. This is just this is a an ecological representation of that hospital building that I showed you. Really what it is it's the 14 floors of one building, and it is a connectedness diagram that you might use for something like river ecology. And what we're showing is each line represents a hallway, and each dot represents a room. And we organize those rooms by connectedness in spatial proximity. And then the different colored dots are a time series of hospital-associated infection. In particular, one specific bacteria called Clostridioides difficile, or C. diff. If you've ever had it or know somebody who has had it, I'm sorry, it's no fun. It rocks your bowels for weeks, and some people never recover, and some people never fully recover. It kills about 8% of the people who get it. It causes long-term dietary restrictions to other people who don't. It even results in oftentimes bowel resections and intestinal resections, living with things like colostomy bags. None of this stuff is super fun. And of course, this is something that we're super concerned about from a hospital safety standpoint, and had been studying pre-COVID. And this map was trying to understand, are there spatial or proximity relationships? And just showing this data in this way, I started to see some patterns where there are some points of intersection where there are more crossovers. There do seem to be some clustering occurring. So next slide, we're going to take you to a different type of data, same study, different type of data. This is where we went into a couple of rooms. We had about a dozen or so rooms enrolled in this study. I'm just showing you two, just to give you a little bit of an understanding. We sampled multiple locations, and you can see those with the different dots, the ventilation, the keyboard, the bed rail, the call button, the alarm there, the chair, etc., the wash basin. And we sampled at 3 different time points. The first one is just what you're seeing here at the diagnosis, or DX. And then we sampled again right before they were discharged. Now that might be a couple of weeks later. In some cases, it was several months later, because this infection can take a very, very long time to run its course. And then the third time after cleaning. And I will say that if it was determined to be a hospital-associated infection, as opposed to a community-acquired case of C. difficile, oftentimes insurance companies won't pay for the charges. So this is very, very important for hospitals. Nearly every hospital system, just one bacteria like this probably costs them millions of dollars a year, not to mention the other outbreaks that might happen. Okay, so this is 3 slides in a row. You're going to see the DX, the BC, and the AC. So here's at diagnosis. As soon as they start presenting with symptoms, we only study patients that presented with symptoms at least 4 days after coming into the hospital, which doesn't guarantee that it was hospital acquired, but almost guarantees that it wasn't community acquired. And you can see the red dots are the places in each room that tested positive. So both rooms at diagnosis had 3 locations that tested positive. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the locations changed. And this was right before discharge. So now the patient is no longer infectious, doesn't test positive for C. diff any longer. About to head home. What was interesting, patient 6 had a reduction in the bacterial load in the space, but patient 9 actually had an increase in at least in the number of locations that tested positive. Okay, so the big question is, how clean is clean? Go to the next slide. So patient 6, absolutely everything we hoped for. After they did their deep cleaning and they actually do UVC irradiation, we were no longer able to detect the presence of the bacteria. Fantastic. However, that isn't always the case. And that is to say that there are traces of the bacteria that can be found. And here you can see in the room patient 9, indeed, there was viable bacteria found even after the deep cleaning. Now, it could have just been that patient 9 was a super shedder, as we've heard, and that maybe explains why. Next slide. Okay, COVID-19. I have to give you the hit list. This has become fairly well established at this point. We wrote a paper in early March. It ended up going through 5 different revisions and preprint publications, and then 2 revisions as a journal. It's published in M Systems. We had an interesting set of conversations with ASHRAE task force as they were working through our paper in terms of considering it as part of their recommendations. We talk a lot about masks. The paper was actually published pretty early. It was in April when it finally came published in the journal article. At that point in time, CDC, WHO, nobody was saying wear masks. We were saying wear masks. However, there was also a mask shortage, and so we were saying prioritize masks for healthcare workers, and a lot of the research about homemade masks wasn't even available yet. We also talked a lot about building operations, outside air. We talked about windows. ASHRAE wasn't super excited about us talking about windows, I will say, and I get it because you can create some negative pressures when you didn't mean to. You can have some backflow. You can have re-entrant air. There are some reasons to be concerned about window ventilation, but I will say for the vast majority of building stock, it's your best chance to get more fresh air, and it's in your control. Of course, we're all for increasing outside air if your system can, if the capacity can handle it, if your variable air volume system can do it. I think this is all about dilution. The solution to pollution is dilution. These steps can help mitigate, reduce risk, no guarantee. There's another way to do that, of course, is just air change per hour. Those are 2 levers. You can decide how to pull them. Some systems might be easier to pull one than the other. Every air change, if you can increase from 1 air change to 2 air changes per hour, or much less like a hospital at 12 or 20, you can push all that air through the filter and reduce biomass and associated that's caught up in the airstream. And then, of course, you can increase filtration. These are really practical strategies that most buildings can do something. For example, a lot of universities have moved to 100% outside air. School districts are considering it. Can't do it all the time in many systems because your heating or cooling can't keep up, but this is a recommendation that we're saying, at least understand what your system is capable of. And I think from the Building Commissioning Association standpoint, this should keep you all very busy, hopefully doing meaningful work that help keep society safer, but helping the folks that you have relationships with understand the capabilities of their systems to increase air change, outside air fraction, and filtration. You can't just put HEPA filters in every system. You all know that, but not everybody does. And that's where you're, I think, really critical and help save lives and reduce outbreaks. And then we talked about disinfection and a whole host of different strategies. We didn't get into any of them in great detail. Our general guidance was do your homework, try to find well-established studies, at least for other viruses, if not coronavirus. And talked about UVC, talked about the benefit of sunlight. Yes, our glass filters much of the UV light, but not all. And the paper that came out by Dabisch, D-A-B-I-S-C-H, shows relatively rapid inactivation with UVA, UVB. And if you open a window and actually get the direct light to come in, you're getting some fresh air as well as some sunlight. Next slide. Okay, so I think because the next video won't work, I'll pause on this slide just a little bit and say there's a whole long debate about droplets versus aerosols versus ultrafine aerosols, and this protracted airborne debate continues. I don't know when or if the burden of proof will become large enough that, you know, folks like the CDC and the WHO will take that next step to call it airborne. But I can say this, look, people are in buildings. They spend a lot of time in buildings, and 90% of our lives are indoors. We know infection is happening indoors. We've seen outbreaks, especially in, you know, poorly ventilated spaces with higher occupant densities and longer periods of time, therefore increasing exposure. That's not the only thing that increases exposure, you know, heavier respiratory rates, et cetera. But this slide just shows that we do walk around leaving plumes. And those can get caught up in airstreams. The next slide is actually a video that, I don't think will play, but I'm happy to provide links to these videos. They're all on my YouTube account. And it just shows the Wuhan, or the Guangzhou restaurant in China, and it actually got airtime on CBS. It became the top downloaded thing on CBS this week. I don't know. This one looks like it might play. And it really is just picking up this idea that there are different sized droplets, and they can be caught up in air systems. The first one here, the famous restaurant in China, they basically had some sort of fan coil or maybe even a mini split on the wall, and it wasn't providing fresh air, or their fresh air system was separated and shut down. And this is showing a relatively accurate depiction of the attack rate of that particular event. And really, just as a way to try to educate people, we said, look, what if you increase the outside air fraction? Here we're showing it by opening a window. You're increasing it also by adding the exhaust fan. And it just shows conceptually how the attack rate could have been less. This restaurant is actually the case study of a lot of research, been highly studied. This video came out before the detailed studies, and I'm pleased to say it was a relatively educated interpretation of the events that happened there. And it's probably our best chance right now to understand the attack rate and the benefit of ventilation to minimize attack rate. Next slide. I wanted to just show a little bit of our more recent research on COVID in hospitals. This is with an amazing partner at Oregon Health and Science University. I have to say kudos to them for being vulnerable and taking a study on like this and allowing me to talk about it. I will say they are above best practices in every measure that we've seen in terms of their ventilation systems, and they're really operating a really fine hospital. And I think what we are showing you here is probably a best case scenario where a lot of other hospitals might actually have even worse scenarios. So next slide, I'm just going to show you 3 slides from this particular study. This is on the OB ward. All of these rooms were empty. They were clean. They had not had a COVID patient on that ward in over 11 days. And what was the other one? Some of the rooms never had a COVID patient in it. In fact, this room is a neutral pressure room, never had a COVID patient in it. And you can see the blue box by the door is the exhaust air for the room, and we swabbed the exhaust air, and that swab was a positive swab. And so we were detecting the presence of the virus by looking at the genetic material called RNA, and we also found it on the bathroom floor. A lot of the other locations we sampled were negative, and this was really meant as a baseline. We did this very early on in early April, and this was the first results from that study. Next slide. shows a negative pressure isolation room, sorry, one back, and that negative pressure isolation room, if you could go one back, there we go. The negative pressure isolation room is just like it sounds. This is where they suck all the air out of the hospital, and this is where you put your sickest people who you don't want the air spreading into other locations. Perhaps not surprisingly, we saw it in this room. Again, it had been 11 days, but this room did have a patient in it previously. And the one thing to note here, all the ones with the black circle around it and the red fill, those are positive locations. But you see the one dot in the bottom left corner is a positive passive settling dish. And that means we just set a dish out on the counter for an hour, and the dust that fell into that dish, either from the air or potentially resuspended, but we do try to be careful when we set them down. The dust in that settling dish was positive, which gave us some pause. The next slide shows an operating theater. Now this has 20 air changes per hour. This is MERV 15 filtration. It's not quite HEPA, but it's pretty high MERV. And you can see in the corner of that room, we also had a passive settling dish. This triggered us to say, okay, we better test the air handling system. So if you go 2 slides forward, you'll see the preprint. This is out on medRxiv. It's the only paper that I've seen. And if you find another one, please send it to me, that shows the presence of the genetic material in air handlers. Go to the next slide. You can see the map of the air handlers. There's a gang of 3 air handlers that serves a good chunk of the left side of that tower. 2 air handlers, 9 and 10, serve the top several floors, 7 floors, and then another air handler serves the bottom 4. Now, they had COVID positive patients in all of these locations at one point or another over the course of the study. And what we were seeing here is all of the air handlers had locations that sampled hot. Next slide shows us basic schematic of the air handler. Every air handler we tested had positive samples at the pre-filter, the final filter, and on the supply air dampers, which is not the supply grills in the room, but the supply air dampers at the air handler. Okay, so I'm going to end with kind of three slides and of content, and then I'll show you a little bit of what I'm really excited about. So if we could skip down to slide 46, a little bit further, there you go. We just need to recognize that we're living inside of this, pandemic, inside of a climate change crisis. And we have to figure out ways to solve both at the same time. And I'm all for more challenging problems because it forces more innovative thinking. And, imagine trying to operate your building in climate change mode where you're trying to minimize energy consumption at the same time as you're trying to operate it in pandemic mode where you're going 100% outside air and increasing air change rates. These are at odds with one another. Imagine trying to occupy your building in climate change mode when in your region that means wildfire smoke. And you're also trying to operate it in pandemic mode where you're at absolute polar opposites about how you might want to operate your air systems. That forces different thinking. We have to innovate. We have to create new tools to solve both of those problems concurrently. Next slide. You'll see that I'm thinking a lot about community design here as well and thinking about low carbon living. And there's some interesting challenges with this. If you think about low carbon living, you want occupant density. But then if you have too much density, you're pushing against your social distancing. And we're not occupying downtown high rises right now, right? And so this is another wicked challenge that we need to work through. Next slide. What I'm trying to get at with this slide is that there are some things that do the both and that's where we need to spend our time. So daylighting, for example, is a great example of a both and. Daylight and oftentimes fresh air can work many times of the year to reduce energy consumption and reduce indoor environmental load. If we think about natural materials, a lot of the time those have natural humidity buffers that can actually also support wellness as well as, reduce. It's shown that more middle range humidity has some inactivation effects on the virus, but also supports the human immune system by not cracking and drying our mucous membranes. Okay, and I had a couple of more details, but I'm going to have you skip down 8 slides to slide 56. And I'm just going to explain this concept of testing in buildings. Looks like it's going to let you run this one. That's awesome. So we can test buildings for coronavirus. We are already, and I just wanted to share this with you and say I do believe the future is that there will be technology sensing viruses in buildings and doing pathogen detection in real time. We're not real time yet, but we're doing 24-hour turnaround on surface samples and air samples collected from buildings, overnight shipped back to our lab, and the results digitally delivered within 24 hours. And I do believe that you can use that knowledge to guide building operational decisions and really start to focus your targeted human testing, launch contact tracing, implement maybe not continuous increased outside air fraction, air change rate, it maybe not continuous UVC germicidal irradiation, but use it when you need it. And more importantly, this is bringing data to the problem, because so many of these technologies, we just have no idea if they work. We're going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at it, and we don't know which one works the best. I shouldn't say that we don't know that they work, but we want to use them prudently. We want to use them when we need them, not routinely. We can't afford to do everything all the time. Can we bring a data stream, like testing our buildings for pathogens, for the presence of the virus, to then guide all these other strategies? And my answer and my plea is really, yes, we can. Look, COVID has robbed us of community. It's decimated the economy. And while I do believe people are the engine of the economy, people occupying buildings really is the engine of the economy. It's where innovation happens. It's where collaboration happens. It's where community building happens. We've put so much investment into our infrastructures. And whether it's the high-rise World Trade Center of downtown New York, or whether it's our local K-12 school, we need to figure out ways to reopen our buildings, to be able to reopen our economy. Next slide will just explain a little bit why I'm so passionate about this and why I really believe it works. I'm almost done. This is the South Korean call center, published in March. It had a 45% attack rate on the 10th floor. Almost half of the people got infected. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit of retroactive contact tracing. And what they did was they asked every person in that building, as of February 9th or March 9th, when they shut the building down, to talk about if they were symptomatic, when they were symptomatic, and then they tested everybody. And they found that there were symptomatic individuals in that building as early as February 22nd. And I will argue that probably that person was infectious as early as, February 17th, February 20th, and started showing symptoms on the 22nd. So this could have given us as much as a 3-week head start on the major outbreak. And whether or not our systems of detection are sense enough to detect one person, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm actually fairly confident that we could. But definitely that spike in February 28, 29, and probably a few days before it, when those individuals were pre-symptomatic, shedding virus into that space, we could have identified this as early as, February 20th to 25th, somewhere in that week. And I really believe we could have avoided that peak in the early week of March. And whether or not we could avoid it or minimize it, I think both are good. And most importantly to this, I think, is the value of a data stream and the value of visualizing this unseen phenomenon that's occurring in our buildings. Okay, last slide. It just is about we're living in a new world. A new world needs new frontiers, and we're really excited to be participating in this space. Last slide just shows contact information. Would love to open it up for questions, and you can follow up on I guess my email's not there, but it's kevinvdw@uoregon.edu. So I'm pretty easy to find. Happy to take questions.
Sorry about that. Okay, we got
Dan here. I'm going to read the questions from our chat window here in no specific order. So first one, last one. Instead of unitary air handling units, would you recommend AHUs that only serve one floor or even one single TI, maybe tenant improvement space? Do you have any evidence of a room-to-room transmission, under door or anything like that of COVID-19?
So we have anecdotal evidence in that we knew that the operating room that we tested had never had a COVID positive patient in it, and that's pretty high standard room. It's 20 air changes per hour. It does have an occupied and unoccupied mode. It's got an anteroom. It's got MERV 15 filtration. We picked it up in passive air. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it came through the air system or necessarily under the door. It could have been brought in on the lab coat of somebody who was coming into that room for a pre-operation. It could have come in on a cart. It could have come in on a lot of things. So we don't 100% know, but we did find it in the passive air settling plate in that room when we knew but nobody had been in there. And so that's what kind of clued us into testing air systems. I think if you can follow the flow of your supply and your returns, I think you can have a really good sense for what the sort of paths of risk might be. Of course, you have to have an infected individual to have a risk, right? But I think you could do that tracing. In fact, that's what we are doing here at University of Oregon. We're tracing our supplies and our returns and trying to understand those pathways and using that as another layer with our occupant density. And then to your question about modes of ventilation, I think just like understanding that ventilation is a big piece of the solution set as much as it is part of a concern, right? Because if you're recirculating air, you have some risk. But every time you're recirculating air, you're pushing it over the filter, and that removes some of the biomass. And so air change and outside air fraction coupled with filtration or tripled with filtration, I think is a good strategy. We need to learn more about what's most effective. And then to the last part about kind of room by room filtration, I think it's a really intriguing idea to look at units that are minimizing shared air spaces. So whether that's displacement ventilation and once through air, or whether it's trickle vent windows with exhaust in room, there's a lot of ways to solve that problem, but I do think that's part of our future.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question, and I believe that the timing on this was during the red circle and the Petri dish timing, so relate to that. Did you check the filter installation for tightness sealing versus bypass in any of this evaluation?
Yeah, good question. Many people are aware in the healthcare environment of the Seattle Children's bypass filtration issue and some of the results of that. So for better or for worse, that happened. The worst, of course, is well documented, but for the better, it did spur many of the hospitals in our region to do bypass tests. And so they had recently done one and showed minimal, or, I don't know, I'm not a mechanical engineer, so I don't know the numbers exactly, but I do know that they were not concerned about bypass. So that is something I did follow up after I had a whole list of questions from the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force about that paper.
Great. Okay, regarding the COVID-19 swabs at the hospital, did the positive PCR tests contain active or inactive virus mRNA?
Yeah, so all of the results you saw today are the presence of the RNA. So that means we don't know if it's active or inactive. We are working on culture work, which will help us determine the viability of any of the samples that we've collected. The truth of the matter is every time you freeze that sample, it has a log reduction in viability, and therefore it will be that much harder to culture. So probably we're going to be looking forward and collecting new samples for future culture work. That requires biosafety level 3 labs. Those are incredibly hard to come by. They're also very busy doing vaccine research, and so getting time in a BSL-3 is tough right now. We have 3 leads, and we're building partnerships with all 3, and hopefully we'll be able to deliver viability results soon. I will say, however, if you're doing a surveillance technology where you're testing maybe every day, every other day, every third day even, and you see a spike in the signal, even if it is just detecting RNA, I think you have a pretty good sense that that could be a new introduction and then very likely viable virus.
Okay, thank you. One here, and I'm not sure if it's in your wheelhouse, but it's looking to discuss current code trends towards the tighter buildings with less ventilation, for example, minimum outside air, dedicated outside air, or DOAS systems. And are we making matters worse? Do you think that COVID-19 is enough to drive a change in kind of the codes and standards?
Yeah, I do think it's enough to drive a change. I think we're going to see it. It's playing itself out through ASHRAE committees already, though preliminary in nature, and you know these things take time. It does keep me up, let's just say, this balancing act at night. It keeps me up at night, the balancing act between health and energy, and we have to find ways that we can get to both and, because there are many strategies where you have to prioritize health at the expense of energy. And I do think we have to prioritize health. Like, that's why we're building buildings in the first place, is, you know, productivity and health. But we have to make sure that we're not implementing practices that are going to exacerbate our climate change, because that's a downward spiral. It's sort of a death spiral. The more energy we produce, the worse our climate, you know, And there's even evidence to show that folks who have exposed to more particulate matter have greater susceptibility to things like coronavirus.
Great. Doctor, I think this one's to you, not me still. Doctor, in your tests, there are tests being conducted with new technology for air handling equipment, such as new filter designs or different types of devices like UV lighting. So yeah, just in your analysis, is it just using the inherent systems, or, you know, is this also evaluating some of these new trends that we're seeing?
Yeah, so the CDIF study I showed is the only data pre-post clean where the clean include ultraviolet irradiation. That is implemented in many hospitals, though oftentimes not as widespread as you might realize or you might expect inside of hospitals. So I've spoken with hospitals that use it, but they only use it for their bone marrow transplant ward, which is, you know, where the most immunosuppressed individuals are. And, you know, ultraviolet irradiation, if you're bringing in a robot or something like that, it takes time and they got to get these beds filled. So that's a problem. There are several versions of UV germicidal irradiation. There's a lot of research behind UVC for other viruses. And so it is a place I point folks to. I'm reading as fast as I can about bipolar needlepoint and bipolar ionization. I have some concerns about all of these disinfection strategies, regardless whether it's UVC or bipolar ionization or just even chemical treatments, about secondary consequences. I believe we have to manage the acute problem, which is this virus staring us in the face. We have to do that, but we also have to be careful about longer-term low-dose exposures, or even something as wild as the idea of creating superbugs. I don't think there's a reason UVC works, and it's because bugs aren't used to seeing it. It doesn't make its way through the atmosphere. So, you know, I think we have to prioritize the acute concerns, but we have to also be mindful of those long-term and secondary consequences.
Yeah, I was a little confused. The next question was, what are your thoughts on needlepoint? I thought we were getting a little bit off topic, but I guess we talked about
yeah, my grandma is really good at. Yeah, like I said, the idea with needlepoint bipolar ionization is it's really intriguing because it can get the biomass to fall out of the air more quickly, and it can actually. I understood originally that it sounded like it sort of treated it in the duct, but it doesn't seem like that's the case. It actually charges the whole air volume. You know, for better or for worse, you're hearing me describe what I understand the current science to be. I'm reading on this presently. And the idea, even with like humidification, getting the biomass to fall out of the air more quickly because it's, you know, in the case of humidification, heavier, more dense, I think is super intriguing, because then it can be cleaned up more easily off the floor and less likely breathed in. But the negative consequences of this could be ozone and secondary chemical interactions with ozone.
Gotcha. It seems like you're reading the questions before I even get to them on our end. But how does increasing humidity help control the microbial contaminants viruses, which I think you just touched on? But
yeah. So there's three ways. Humidity supports human immune function by keeping your mucous membranes healthy and the ciliary action, getting any sort of unwanted pathogen out of your mucous membranes. The second is just physics, particle physics. Heavier particles, if you will, more water-laden particles drop out of the air more quickly. They are more like droplets, less like ultrafine aerosols, if that makes sense. And then the third, there's emerging research on this for coronavirus, but more research for previous viruses, like influenza, that relative humidity in the 40 to 60% range, which is probably more just indicative of absolute humidity somehow, does inactivate the virus more quickly than drier air or, interestingly, very, very moist air. So more research on there for influenza, less available on the novel coronavirus.
Okay, we're going through these. With many filters being electrostatically charged, do you have any thoughts on the efficacy reduction over time on these filters? And should we be shifting to non-electrostatically charged filters?
Ooh, super good question. I'm barely into my reading on this, and I'll just say we are currently researching which microbes are more attracted or less attracted to these techniques. And I just don't have a lot to say yet. I'm sorry. I wish I could provide a better answer. I'm happy if that individual would email me. It's on my reading list, so I'll try to keep you apprised of what I learn.
Okay. And do you recommend for a 100% return air to be exhaust for future design? Do you think that'll ever be a implemented strategy?
Well, it already is in many settings. And for example, University of Oregon, they've announced that they're going 100% outside air in any facility that can. That turns out to be about 85% of our facilities. I think it's a short-term solution to solve the acute problem. I think we need to bring data to that to make sure we don't get ourselves in even a stickier climate change predicament from an energy consumption standpoint.
Okay. And last question, is there anything out there that the recommending bodies are putting out there that's kind of counterintuitive to your findings? You guys made the recommendations for masks before it was out there. Anything that, it's harmful that they're putting out there right now?
I've read a lot of debate in ASHRAE circles about the value of some of these recommendations because they might cost a lot of money to implement. And I don't think anybody really knows the wisest investment. And if you're going to spend, I'll pick a number. If you're going to spend $5 a square foot to try to do something, first of all, I don't think it's a universal answer. I think it highly depends on your activity, your plans for occupant density, your current system facility infrastructure and operational, paradigm. And so I don't think it's a universal answer, and I think it's a difficult answer to try to discern. I wish, I'm personally convinced that this disease is transmissible via aerosols, and I don't really care to split hairs about whether it's called airborne, because I think there's some reasons why there's folks, that are not willing to call it airborne. The burden of proof is really high, and then there's also is it the primary mode of transmission or is it the secondary? And definitions that might dictate which words you use. Look, I think it's transmitted via aerosols, and we should treat it as seriously as we're treating hand washing or spatial distancing. That's the most. I wish we could get focused on aerosols so that we can then evaluate with better data which of these mitigation strategies are most effective. And I think in general we're missing a big data opportunity here, where we can sync up building exposure risk with outbreaks, with practices. So and with community risk profiles. So my hope is that we can do better job sharing data, and I hope that we can treat aerosols more seriously, so we can bring we can test which strategies are most effective.
Okay, on that, I think we're going to be closing up. So I have to say thank you so much, Dr. Kevin. Hopefully, we'll see you at a future conference to give us your updates and the latest and updated information. And I appreciate everyone for attending today's opening plenary. Just one more plug for the upcoming conference. We still have, you still have more than enough time to register for the conference. Head over to bcxa.org to register. It's a quick and easy registration. If you have any questions, reach out to myself, Sherry, Liz, anyone over in the offices. And we look forward to a very successful, positive, and beneficial conference for everybody. So thank you so much, Dr. Kevin, and thank you out there in BCA land. Yeah,
thanks everybody. I really think the work you're doing is critically important, always has been. I've been an energy efficiency guy my whole life, and I've always been impressed with your profession, and I think it's even more important now. Thanks so much.
Too kind. Thank you very much, guys. All right, signing off.
Thank you, everyone.